And thanks for inviting me to do this. So this is my presentation on Arabic vernacular use online. And it's a little bit different from the study. I recollected my corpus, so it's actually an 11-year study. So it's 2010, 2021. So it's a little bit different than the description that went out. But
sorry.
Oh, no, I didn't send you an update. It's okay. I just decided to do this. So during this presentation, I'm going to be looking at language change in the Arab world. And I'm going to be examining it through a study of the changing patterns of language use on one particular Tunisian internet forum from 2010 to 2011. So I'll start off a little bit talking about the background about Diglossia and language use online in the Arab world. And then I'll go over the questions I'm trying to answer and the methods that I used in this study to answer them, and then what the results that I got from that. And then we'll kind of discuss what this says about language change in the Arab world, and then go to response and questions. So I think most of you who are watching this right now are probably familiar with Diglossia, but for those of you who are not, this is kind of an important thing to know about Tunisia. It's like all Arab countries, considered a diglossic language situation. And what that means is that there are two forms of a language in use. It was this term was defined by Charles Ferguson in 1959. It has this very, very well-known definition. So diglossia is a language situation that is relatively stable. We'll talk about that more, where in addition to the primary dialects of the language, which may include standard or regional standards. So for instance, in Tunisia, you have the language of the capital, you have the dialect of the capital, and it's different from the dialect of the countrysides, and it's different from the dialect of other cities. But in addition to all of that, there's a highly divergent, codified, often grammatically more complex, superposed variety, which all of you from the Arabic department will know as al-Fusha. So it's standard Arabic, the vehicle of a large and respected body of written literature from an earlier period, in this case, that's learned by formal education and is used for most written and formal spoken purposes, but is not used by any sector of the community for ordinary conversation. So there's a completely different language variety, Tunisian Arabic, Derja, that's used for ordinary conversation. And this is the situation throughout the Arab world. And the situation has changed significantly since Charles Ferguson wrote these words in 1959, but it's still clearly a diglossic situation. So Ferguson defined them in 59, and everyone has been arguing about the concept basically nonstop since then. And diglossia, even though it is relatively stable, diglossia in the Arab world has been stable for 1,000 years or something like that. It does change. It can change over time. And this scholar Fassel described what happens when diglossia change. So you see two main things. You see a leakage in function and a mixing in form. So the leakage in function, when Ferguson defined diglossia, he talked about specific characteristics that it had. One of it was that it has this functional distribution. You use one language variety, either he called them the high and the low, for certain purposes, and you absolutely cannot use the other language variety for that purpose. You can't stand up in front of a parliament and give a speech in Derja or, the vernacular, and you can't, talk to your loved ones about your relationship in the formal high variety. Like there's these separate functions. So when he's talking about leakage in functions, it means the functions that used to only be done in one variety, the other variety begins to be used for that. And then the second thing is a mixing in forms. When you get this leakage in function, you get mixes of the languages where instead of being very kind of separate codes, you'll have a sentence which mixes elements of both. And this kind of mixing actually did exist even in the 1950s when Ferguson was writing, but it was at a much lower level than what we see now. We'll talk about that more later. So as this leak increases from a drip to a torrent, diglossia becomes language shift. So when there's substantial leakage of the high or the low varieties into the functions of the opposite variety, this is usually a sign of the incipient breakdown of the diglossic relationship. That's what Fassel said back in the 80s. And then another scholar who's done a lot of work on diglossia, his name's Alan Hudson. He explains this by saying that this defining characteristic of compartmentalization, functional compartmentalization, is not actually a defining characteristic, is actually a prerequisite, because unless you keep the two language varieties separate, then they eventually mix and converge, and you don't have two language varieties anymore. So we've seen a lot of this leakage and a lot of this mixing in the Arab world. Those of you who either saw my presentation in Tucson, or else the last of these colloquiums, which was back before the pandemic, that's what I presented on, is all of these ways that Tunisian Arabic is leaking into writing, which it used to, is the process that I examined it as I analyzed it in the paper I wrote about it, is kind of in two phases. So you get this really slow leakage in the 80s, where you start to see things like, billboards and advertisements written in Tunisian Arabic, and, a little bit more use of like Tunisian Arabic in the dialogues of novels. And then in the second decade of this century, so basically post-revolution, post-internet, these like little trends suddenly explode, and there is written Tunisian Arabic just everywhere. So you have online, you have Facebook and Twitter and all of these things. And then also we get the first Tunisian Arabic novel written in 2013. And then as of now, there's like 9 of those. So it's something that's been happening for a while, but in the last decade, it's been happening very, very quickly, which is why I chose this period for the study. So what I'm looking at specifically in the study is this tunisiasat.com. This is a forum. It describes itself on its Facebook page as the largest online community of Tunisians. I don't know if that's true, but I know that it is a very large community. It has, millions of posts and, millions of people who participate in it, and it covers a lot of different topics. So it's very good for this study that I'm using. This is the homepage of it. You can see there's all these different forums on different subjects. So this is like general and news and sports, Islam, advice, family life, these kind of things. So really kind of broad topics. And forum topics like this are a really good example of that kind of mixing that Fasold was talking about. So if we look at this sample post, this is from 2010, and this is the 5th post in this thread. And so we have this quoted previous post at the top here, and then a response. And over here, if we look at the language in it, so it starts out with, in this quoted text, MashaAllah, Rabbit Mumtaz, like awesome, that's a great link. لكن ينقص بعض العناصر, but it's missing some stuff. يعني فيها الحاجات الكبيرة. I mean, it's got the big stuff. لكن فما أمور أخرى كيف ديكور بيتك وفراشات وزرابية. But there are other things like home decor and furnishing carpets. بين قوسين أما تلاحوني. By the way, take a look here. So the original post was asking about resources for like getting a list of all the things you need to buy when you get married. And so this person is responding and saying, oh, well, that's great, but here, look, there's some other stuff too. Now the text here, the underlying text is pretty Tunisian Arabic. The bolded text is like 100% standard Arabic. And then the things that are not bolded or underlined could be read as both, like depending on how you say it, or some of them are the both, no matter how you say it. So you can see that there's a lot of things that are neutral. They could go either way. And then there's the sentence that's like entirely Fusha, and then this sentence, you have a mixture of Tunisian Arabic and Fusha together. If we look at the response to that, we can kind of see that like this mixing, it's not just random, just people talking however they want, and they just throw things, here and there with no rhyme or reason to it. There actually are like really solid discourse reasons why people use different varieties. So the response to this guy says, "Wali mishmina Bardo shiamel." So what are you supposed to do if you're not from Bardo? Bardo is this really kind of fancy district in Tunis. So basically, like, if you're not rich, what are you supposed to do? Because apparently this list that she posted just had a lot of really expensive things. And he says, thank you for your addition. Walau inaha ishar tabar, even if it's kind of an advertisement. And then your akhuk fi'la, your brother in Islam. So what he's saying here, he starts out in 100% Tunisian Arabic. Like, it's has strong emotional impact. Like, this is very kind of, he's making an exclamation and he's saying it the same way that if he was speaking face to face with this person, he would say. So being in Tunisian Arabic, it adds an emotional impact that would not be there if it was in standard Arabic. And then he goes on to thank the person for her addition, but then he adds a little bit of a criticism that what she had linked to was really kind of an advertisement. But he softens the criticism, and he softens it by making it in standard Arabic, which lessens the emotional impact of it, and then also putting it in this lighter font here. So he's really making it softer. Like, he's criticizing her, but not like in a really aggressive way. And then he thanks her. So you can see here, like, how the language of varieties, they're not just used together, they're also used for very specific discourse purposes. And then we have posts that are like this. So you can see this post here is entirely in French. This one is in Tunisian Arabic. And then one is in Tunisian Arabic written in French letters. So the 5 is the ha, the 3 is the ain. So and there's French code switching there. So what we can see here is that this language, if we had to characterize the language variety used on internet forums, it's a lot of mixing. There's kind of not very good information about how exactly this mixing happens, or which language varieties are dominant. If you ask anyone, people will say, oh, people use vernacular online, Arabs use vernacular online. Like, that seems to be kind of the general impression. It's what most people think of from their own personal interactions, but there hasn't been a lot of research really quantifying that. And the research that does exist is somewhat contradictory. So Lotfi Siyahi, who's done a lot of work on Tunisia, he did a study of a soccer forum, a Tunisian soccer forum in 2014. And he found that that about half the posts were in French, half of them were in Tunisian Arabic, and the ones that were written in Tunisian Arabic were almost entirely Romanized. Like, there was almost no Tunisian Arabic written in Arabic script on this forum. And he explains that it is hard to find an Arabic keyboard in a public internet space. And this kind of fits with my personal experience also. Like, I've seen every computer I've seen that family members and everything have in Tunisia, like, they have French keyboards. I haven't seen one where it actually has the Arabic letters printed on the keyboard. I'm sure they exist, I just haven't seen them. But so there's this. And then Kobe, who works on Morocco, has written that Arabic script is really not very common there also, even when people are writing in Moroccan Arabic, because people are just used to writing in French. So he says, for the general public and internet users, the passage to Arabic script is recent and slow, simply because people find it difficult to type in Arabic. That's a little bit of a tautology, because people find it difficult to type in Arabic because they don't type in Arabic very much. So it's kind of saying, that people don't type in Arabic because they don't type in Arabic. But there is this concept that North Africa in general has been slower to move to typing in Arabic versus either in a foreign language or, in Romanized Arabic, because, the influence of French is so strong in North Africa, and because they have that as another option. And, it goes without saying that when internet technology and mobile phones first entered the Arab world, there wasn't an ability to type in Arabic. So, the earliest users started out typing either in foreign languages or in Arabizi, in Romanized Arabic. And so at some point had to switch. And then we have this study from 2020 that Kashina looked at Facebook groups, and he found that most of the Facebook group posts were in Tunisian Arabic, in Arabic script. So 71% were in Tunisian Arabic. Most of those were in Arabic script, a small amount in Roman script. There was 21% in MSA, and then only 7% in French. So really kind of contradictory results here. And Kashina's study was a bit problematic, but so I think it really leaves open the question of, how do people write online in the Arab world? So in what language variety and what script do Tunisians write online? And has this changed over time? Because the contradiction that we just saw in the research, it could not be a contradiction. It could be in 2014 that there really was a different pattern of writing than there is in 2020. So that's the question that I set out to examine with this study. So I'm doing this through a corpus, looking at, there's different ways you can address this. You could do a survey of people about how they write online, but what I'm doing is looking at actual posts that people have written online and what language variety those posts are in. So I collected a large corpus from the Tunisia Stat website, and here are the details of that corpus. So I collected actually two separate corpora. The first is from 2010, and the second is from 2021. So there are some differences here that are kind of clear even just from these numbers. So first of all, 2010, there's 23 categories that were available for people to use in 2000, and by categories, I mean like actual, separate forum topics. 2021, there were 29. The 2021 corpus is quite a bit larger than the 2010, and it's not necessarily meaningful that it's larger. I just let the web scraper run for a certain amount of time, and it collected a lot more posts. The number of posts is not quite double. The word count is above double. So the length of the post is a little bit larger in 21, but the real difference is in the activity on each thread. So they have about the same amount of threads in each corpus, but for each thread, there's a lot more posts, almost twice as many posts, responses in 21 compared to 10. And I also have fewer authors in 21, but that's because each author wrote many more posts in 2021 than they did in 2010. So the picture that this is showing just from the profile of the corpus is that in 2021, Tunisia Stat was a lot more active. A lot more people wrote on it. They wrote more posts per user. Their posts were a little bit longer, and that each topic got a lot more comments and responses compared to the same site in 2010. Here's the top 15 of those categories that are on the site, and then the number of posts in each. So these are organized by the 2021 posts. So from the most popular in 2021 going down. And you can see that there's been some large changes in that time. So here on news, the news was not a popular topic at all in 2010, and it's the most popular topic now in 2021. Sports was and remains very popular. And actually, this is something to keep in mind, is the 2010, the bulk of this corpus is made of sports postings. It was by far the most active part of the site at that time, and a lot of the corpus comes from that. And then there's general, and then there's all these technical ones. I think that Tunisia Stat must have started as a forum to discuss satellite technology, because there's all these very specific topics, like Dreambox View Plus is one of these magic boxes that you have in the Arab world where you buy the box and hook it to your TV, and then you can get like every satellite channel in the world without having to pay a monthly subscription. And I think this website started out as a place where people discussed these things because it has a lot of very specific technology, things like that. But after that, it expanded into all of these other topics. And now the most popular topics aren't even technology related, although these are still very popular. Mobile phone and internet providers, that kind of things. But we also have family life and hobbies. And there is an Islamic forum. It was not very popular in 2010 and is even less popular now, but it is there. And then these blank spots are forums that didn't exist in 2010, but were added later. Okay, so now we have an idea of what the corpus looks like. The question becomes now, how do you define language varieties. As we saw from the sample posts, there is a whole lot of mixing going on. How do we look at a post like that and say, oh, this post is in Tunisian Arabic, or this post is in Fusha, or something else? It's not straightforward at all. And that was actually one of the problems with Kashina's study that I mentioned, is they assigned every post one language, and so it's just very difficult to do and doesn't really represent the language situation very well. So to get around that, what I did was I decided to approximate the language use by comparing specific words. So I have a list of word pairs. For instance, the way to say good or well in Tunisian Arabic is behi, and then the way you say that in MSA is good. So my idea is that by looking at like how many times behi appears in 2010 relative to Jayyid, and then how many times it appears relative to Jayyid in 2021, can give us a sense of how much writing in Tunisian Arabic there was in the site in 2010 compared to 2021. Now, it could be that that word could lead us astray, and it could be the one Tunisian Arabic word used in an entirely Fusha post. But the thing is, because I use a list of words, not just a single one, and because these are some of the most common words in the language, a lot of them are, grammatical terms that actually don't mean anything, but are just really super common. That I think that keeps us from getting a distorted picture. And I think the picture that comes out ends up being, pretty accurate. Now in this list, some of the word pairs overlap semantically very well, and some of them don't very well at all. So dima in Tunisian, da'imin in Fusha, this means always, and their semantic overlap is pretty much perfect. They're used, as far as I know, exactly the same way in both language varieties. Then you have something like the word barsha, which is kind of the distinctive Tunisian word. It means very much or a lot. And that equates to two different words in standard Arabic, jiddin and kathirin. One means very much and one means a lot. So when in that case, I compare the counts of barsha to the sum of, the frequency of jiddin and kathirin. And then you have some words that just don't overlap very well at all. So qadi means there or over there in Tunisian Arabic, and its equivalent in standard Arabic is hunaka. But hunaka is also an existential in standard Arabic. It can mean there is, hunaka thalatha tolab fisaf, there are 3 students in the class. And qadi is not used in Tunisian Arabic at all that way. So that means that no matter what, there's going to be a lot more hunaka than qadi. But as we'll see, as we look at the entire list, these kind of problems even out. Okay, so the way that I did this study is first I collected the corpus. I'm going to go really quickly through this. If anyone has any questions or wants to know more about it, I'd be happy to talk about it at the end. But I did all the programming with Python, and I began with a list of search URLs, and then programmed a spider so that it crawled through every thread in the search results, and then for every post in each thread, and then for each post it got the author, and then it did a search for all the posts written by that author and collected all of those. And then along with each post, it collected the post ID, the thread ID, the author ID, the date, and the category. Then I cleaned the data, doing these things that we normally do in NLP, and then connected the analysis using a Python package called Pandas, which I just learned and is awesome, life-changing. Okay, so here is the pair of words that I came up with. I came up with this by using my Tunisian Arabic corpus and pulling out the top 100 most frequent words that are present in the corpus, and then taking out ones where there's ambiguity because it's the same in standard Arabic, or it's spelled the same as something else in standard Arabic, and these kind of things. Or because, it exists in Tunisian, but the concept doesn't exist in standard Arabic, or vice versa. And so after doing all that, I came out with these 15 words. So we have Alesh Behi, Barsha, Dima, Ghadi, Habet, Kima, Mra, Mush, Roho, Gedesh, Tawa, Tahki, Nijm, and Shuf. And then these are the equivalents in Standard Arabic. لماذا جيد جدا / كثيرا دائما هناك ردت مثل امرأة ليس نفسه كم الآن تتكلم تستطيع and tara. And for each of these, I included some variants. So because there's a lot of spelling variation in Tunisian, like these are like 4 different ways that people can spell the word barsha. And then I also included some morphological variants. So like, you know, feminine forms and some of the different conjugations for these verbs. Not all of them though, because like I just, like when I looked at, you know, the different conjugations of to speak, I found that there really was a very small frequency of the other ones. Like most of the time people talk on the forum and they say talking, they're saying you talk. I don't know why, but it was so common, it wasn't worth looking up the other ones. So this is representing all of the talking. All right, so here's the results after I searched for the frequencies of those words. And we're not going to spend very long on this chart. You don't have to send yourself blind trying to understand it. But this is the normalized frequency. So it's the count of each word per million words, per the count of each vocabulary per million words. And so we see these are the counts for Tunisia for the Tunisian variant in 2010, the MSA variant in 2010, the Tunisian variant in 2021, the MSA variant in 2021. And on this chart, I'll just point out something here. So the highlights in yellow are the ones where the Tunisian variant was the most used one. And so like this percentage here, it means the amount of time that people said why. This is the amount of time that they use the Tunisian alesh instead of the Standard Arabic limada. So in 2010, there was only one word where people used the Tunisian more often than the Standard Arabic. In 2021, we see the reverse. All of the Tunisians are more often used than the Standard Arabic, except for 2. And one of them is this weird khadi, hunak. And the other one is the word for woman, which I also have a good explanation for why the semantic overlap. If anyone who wants to know that can ask me in the questions. But so basically we have some outliers, but the general trend is clear here. Here is a much more easily understandable way to see this data. So here are all of the words. The blue is the percentage of counts that were in Tunisian, and then the green is in Standard Arabic. And so this is from 2010, and we can see overall Tunisian was used 24% of the time, and then the rest was MSA. And we can see there's a lot of variation between the words, but you know, they kind of, if you take out the outliers, it's all kind of around here. And that's what we have, 24%. Now, when we look at 2021, wait for it. This is what we see. It's basically reverse. Like it's just a huge increase in the amount that people are writing in Tunisian Arabic on the website compared to Standard Arabic. We see it in all of the vocabulary words, even the little outlier that's hardly used at all increased, although it's still a minority, but some words are almost exclusively Tunisian Arabic now. And averaging over these 15, we get 67% of the words on the site are Tunisian Arabic. So we can kind of, if we buy my premise that these words are a proxy for language use on the site, then we can say that the Tunisian Arabic writing on the site went from 24% in 2010 to 67% in 2021. So a really major increase. Now, I started this project being mostly interested in comparing Tunisian Arabic versus Standard Arabic, but then there are also these other varieties that are used on the site. And so I decided to run the analysis with looking at the French and at the Tunisian Arabic in Latin letters, the Romanized Arabic. Also, I haven't run this yet with the full vocabulary list. So I ran it with just the word always. So dima, daimen, dima, and toujours. This word, like I said, it has very good semantic overlap between at least between Tunisian and Standard Arabic. And then also its frequency is pretty close to the average frequency of the entire list. So I feel like it's a pretty representative word. And we can see here the same pattern, although it's even more pronounced when we look at the other language varieties. So we see in 2010 that French was a good 30% of the linguistic activity on the website. Tunisian was less at 22%, although if you include the Tunisian written in both Arabic and Romanized, it's about the same as the French. Like they add up together, and then a slight majority was Standard Arabic. We look at 2021, we see that the Romanized Arabic has almost disappeared from the site. It's less than 1%. French has also almost disappeared from the site. It's now under 3%. Standard Arabic still has a very strong showing, but now Tunisian Arabic has just grown massively. And most of the activity on the site is now in Tunisian Arabic. So looking at all four varieties, we see an increase from 32% of the activity on the site being in Tunisian Arabic in 2010 to 69% in 2021. I also broke this out by categories because I expected that the different categories, the different forums would have different patterns of language use. I chose just a few of the popular categories that were available in both years and that had a lot of activity in both years. And so we see news, sports, general, medical, mobile, and family. And looking at the 2010 data, I saw pretty much exactly what I would have expected. We see that MSA is very strong in the news, which is not surprising because the news post generally consist of someone cutting and pasting a story from, Al Jazeera or a news website into the forum, and that's the start of the post. And those stories are always going to be in Standard Arabic. So news, Standard Arabic, very expected. And then we get more Tunisian Arabic and French in sports, which is also expected because it's a more informal topic. So, and then in medical, also exactly what we expected. There's a lot of Standard Arabic, but there's also a lot of French because in Tunisia, medical school is taught entirely in French. So when a doctor is speaking about a medical topic, they're really not going to know the words for how to speak about it except in French because that's when the training comes. So, and then also in technology, we have really heavy French, which again is expected because technology was introduced through the French language. The devices were in French. It's just words that exist for them are borrowings from French in general. And then in family, we have, I don't know what, I think I would have expected more Tunisian Arabic in family topics, but instead we're seeing a lot of Standard Arabic, maybe because family topics can maybe overlap with religion a bit. But then in 2021, what we see is that this pattern has really changed. So Tunisian Arabic has become dominant in every category except for medical. And in medical, it's really Standard Arabic that's taken over French, which is an interesting development. And then even in technology, Tunisian Arabic has taken over French. And then all other categories, Tunisian Arabic has displaced the other languages, including Standard Arabic. All right, so what? Like, what's this is one forum in one smallish Arab country. What does it matter? So starting with, this has implications for language change in Tunisia. So some people have suggested that Diglossia is actually breaking down, that the Arab world is in the process of becoming Europe, that there's going to be different national languages in every country, and that MSA will, eventually be used as a liturgical language in mosques, but otherwise not have an official role. Al Khamis 2019 are one of the people who have made the argument that Diglossia is breaking down. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this kind of breakdown of diglossia is not actually inevitable. I think that scholars, and especially Western scholars, tend to act as if it is inevitable, because we're most familiar with diglossia as it existed in Europe in the Middle Ages. We know what Latin was, and we know that it became French and Spanish and Italian, and we know exactly how that happened. And I think it seems to many people to be kind of, a natural process, and like a kind of, modern process. So I think a lot of people expect it to happen and think that it's inevitable, but it isn't actually inevitable. So Catalan went through a period where it was written and became a very strong part of Catalonian identity, and was on the process of becoming a written standardized language. But then the political situation changed, and it kind of reverted to being just a spoken vernacular. So these things do happen, and there's the possibility that what we're seeing on this internet forum is not really diglossia breaking down, but rather you just getting a new functional distribution for this new function that didn't exist any before. This online function, which combines writing and speech, has made its own niche in diglossia, and it's not actually breaking it down. So there's that. But we also have to consider that this is part of a larger trend of expansion of Tunisian Arabic into previously MSA only domains. And this is something that's being documented more and more. So the work that I did, talking about the development of Tunisian Arabic as a literary language in novels and other art forms, and in public life just in general. And then Sayahi has done a lot of work about how even in spoken domains, like in the classroom and in the mosque and on different kind of television and radio programs, that you're seeing more and more Tunisian Arabic used, where in the past it would have been considered appropriate only to use standard Arabic. And a scholar named Ashar Kalal has noted the same things in different contexts. And then also since the revolution, we've seen this expansion of Tunisian Arabic into government, which is unique in the Arab world, and very interesting development. So that I think is a counterpoint to the idea that this is just people talking online in the language of talking, because it's part of this larger trend. And then the implications for the rest of the Arab world, we can ask, how much is Tunisia representative of the Arab world as a large? It is a small country. It's got a population of about 12 million. It's North African, so there are some significant differences between North African countries and Middle Eastern countries. There was a great survey done of residents of Cairo and Rabat a few years ago. And so what that survey, it asked people about their usage of vernacular and Fusha in various different kinds of writing. And it found that 95% of Cairo residents used only vernacular or a mix of vernacular and MSA on Facebook and SMS. And that about 60% of Rabat residents use vernacular in those same contexts, and about 20% use French. So it's likely that Tunisia would model more on Morocco in its linguistic behavior. They have a lot of similarities with the history of French colonialism and things like that. And Egypt has always been in the forefront of vernacular usage. Cairo has been a second written language in Egypt for quite a while. But also these surveys were done a few years ago, 2013 and 2015. And I would bet that if you looked at, a forum in Morocco, during the same period, you would probably find similar results as to what I found in Tunisia, that the use of vernacular online has increased since that survey was done. So I think what we can say is that most Arab countries are likely to be similar to Tunisia in this way, or if anything, they're like Morocco, or they're like Egypt, and they're going to be even more further along in the development of the vernacular as a written language. But hopefully there will be other studies done to quantify this in other countries. But finally, I'd like to leave you with this quote by Marfani, who is a historian who wrote an article in a sociolinguistics journal, just kind of taking down sociolinguistics for some things that they do wrong. And I really like what he said here. The process that made some Latin dialects evolve into Romance vernaculars is not the same kind of process that turns some of those vernaculars into a language. Whereas the former is undoubtedly a sociolinguistic process, the latter is strictly socio-historical, not a linguistic one. Processes of convergence, of Quinoization, of creolization, and such like create new linguistic varieties, but they do not create new languages. So Marfani's point here is that what makes something into a standardized written language, which is what he means by language here, as opposed to a dialect, is not anything that's in the language itself. It's not something, you know, that I can code for and find in my corpus. Rather, it's things that are outside of the language. So the future of what happens with Tunisian Arabic, whether it becomes a national language or whether it, you know, recedes again to a purely spoken vernacular like Catalan, it's not something that's going to be in the language itself. It's going to be entirely based on the political relationship between Tunisia and the rest of the Arab world, and, you know, a lot of kind of factors like that in the future. And that is all I have. So thank you. Merci, shukran, yaishik.